The polished glass doors of Cartwright Sons, New York's most elite jewelry boutique, swung open on a busy Friday afternoon. A rugged farmer stepped inside, his calloused hands and sun-weathered face telling stories of endless days working the land. His faded denim overalls and dusty work boots seemed almost offensive against the store's marble floors and crystal chandeliers. The contrast was jarring, like an oil painting where someone had accidentally splashed mud across its perfect surface. The boutique sparkled with displays of rare diamonds and precious gems, each piece carefully arranged under state-of-the-art lighting that made them dance like stars. The air was heavy with expensive perfume and the quiet murmur of wealthy customers discussing six-figure purchases with impeccably dressed sales associates. Mirrors lined the walls, multiplying the luxury infinitely, while plush velvet chairs invited distinguished customers to sit and contemplate their extravagant purchases. The farmer's presence created ripples through the carefully cultivated atmosphere. His boots left subtle traces of earth on the immaculate floor, each step echoing against the marble in a way that seemed to announce his otherness. The refined clientele stepped aside, their designer outfits a stark contrast to his humble appearance. A woman in a Chanel suit clutched her pearls unconsciously, while a gentleman in an Italian suit adjusted his gold watch, as if to reassure himself of his belonging in this temple of luxury. Behind the counter, sales associates exchanged knowing glances, their practiced smiles failing to hide their disdain. A young saleswoman with perfectly manicured nails and a designer blazer leaned toward her colleague, whispering behind her hand, "Did he mistake us for a hardware store?" Her colleague suppressed a laugh, adjusting his silk tie as he watched the farmer's reflection in the spotless display cases. The farmer moved with unexpected grace, despite his workman's frame, his eyes taking in the splendor around him with quiet appreciation. His rough hands, marked with the evidence of years of honest labor, hung loosely at his sides, occasionally brushing against the worn leather wallet in his back pocket. The wallet itself was as weathered as its owner, its edges softened by years of use, held together by a simple rubber band. The store's security guard, positioned discreetly by the entrance, stepped forward slightly, his hand instinctively moving toward his earpiece. The manager, Mr. Harrison, a man whose tailored suit probably cost more than the farmer's monthly income, emerged from his office, drawn by the unusual disturbance in his perfectly curated world of wealth and refinement. As the farmer approached the most exclusive display case in the center of the store, conversations died completely. The case housed pieces that regularly graced the pages of luxury magazines, items that most people would only ever see behind glass. The afternoon sun, streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, caught the diamonds within, creating a symphony of light that seemed to mock the farmer's plain appearance. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat, exchanging meaningful looks with his staff. They had seen this type before, or so they thought. People wandering in from the street, tourists wanting to glimpse how the other half lived, dreamers who would waste their time only to leave empty-handed. The staff had developed a practiced way of dealing with such intrusions, a polite but firm method of ushering out those who clearly didn't belong. The farmer paused before the central display, his reflection a stark contrast against the gleaming glass. His face, lined with years of working under the sun, showed no sign of intimidation despite the obvious judgment surrounding him. If anything, there was a quiet confidence in his bearing that seemed oddly out of place with his humble attire. The young saleswoman who had whispered earlier nudged her colleague again, rolling her eyes dramatically. "Should we tell him the tractors are sold elsewhere?" she muttered, earning a few subtle chuckles from nearby staff. The sound carried in the quiet store, but the farmer remained unperturbed, his attention focused on something specific in the beige display case. The stage was set, The players were in position, the sophisticated staff, the bewildered onlookers, and the seemingly out-of-place farmer who had dared to enter their world of luxury and privilege. None of them could have predicted what was about to unfold, how this ordinary Friday afternoon would become a story they would tell for years to come. No one in the store realized that this moment was about to shatter their carefully constructed assumptions, teaching them a lesson about judgment that would stay with them forever. The farmer's next move would transform this temple of luxury into a classroom of humility. But for now, the air hung heavy with anticipation and poorly concealed disdain. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows through the boutique's towering windows, the details of the farmer's appearance became even more striking under the unforgiving light. His name was Thomas Miller, though nobody in the store had bothered to ask. His face was a roadmap of dedication. Deep laugh lines around his eyes spoke of joy found in simple pleasures, while the weathered creases across his forehead told stories of countless harvests under unrelenting sun and pouring rain. His overalls, though clean, bore the honest marks of morning chores. Subtle traces of hay and the earthy scent of his apple orchards clung to the fabric. The denim was faded not by design, like the fashion pieces worn by some of the store's usual clientele, but by years of actual work, each fade marking a season of tending to his land. A simple cotton shirt, pressed but worn at the collar, peeked out from beneath the overalls, its plaid pattern as timeless as the man who wore it. The contrast between Thomas and the store's opulent interior grew more pronounced with each passing moment. Cartwright Sons was no ordinary jewelry store. It was a cathedral of luxury where Manhattan's elite came to transform their wealth into wearable art. The displays were arranged like altarpieces, each item positioned to catch the light just, so creating halos around diamonds and casting mysterious shadows behind rare-colored gems. A massive crystal chandelier dominated the central space, its hundreds of facets creating a rainbow dance across the walls. Display cases lined the perimeter like shrines, their contents easily worth more than most people's lifetime earnings. The price tags were discreetly turned away from casual view. In this establishment, if you had to ask the price, you likely couldn't afford it. The sales staff moved about like practiced dancers in a well-choreographed performance. Sarah Chen, the young saleswoman who had made the tractor comment, straightened her Hermes scarf with manicured fingers, a habit she'd developed to show off the designer accessory. James Morton, the senior sales associate, adjusted his gold cufflinks, actual Cartwright & Sons pieces he'd received for 10 years of service. Even the security guard, Michael Torres, wore a suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent. The regular customers present in the store provided their own theatrical backdrop to the unfolding scene. Mrs. Wellington Pierce, a frequent visitor, known for her quarterly purchases of six-figure pieces, perched on one of the velvet chairs, her Coach handbag placed precisely at her feet. She observed Thomas with the kind of fascination usually reserved for exotic creatures in a zoo, occasionally whispering behind her hand to her companion. The store's ambient music, a subtle classical piece selected to encourage feelings of sophistication and exclusivity, seemed to fade into insignificance against the sound of Thomas's work boots on the marble floor. Each step he took echoed with an authenticity that seemed to mock the carefully constructed atmosphere of artificial refinement. Mr. Harrison, the manager, continued to hover nearby, his Italian leather shoes making no sound as he moved. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed, his suit impeccably tailored, everything about him designed to convey authority and taste. Yet something about Thomas's presence made him uncomfortable, like a small crack in an otherwise perfect facade. The air in the store grew thick with tension as Thomas continued his slow, deliberate examination of the displays. The other customers had formed a loose circle around him, maintaining what they considered a safe distance while ensuring they wouldn't miss whatever entertainment might unfold. Their designer shoes and branded accessories formed a stark boundary between their world and his. Sarah Chen whispered to James Morton behind the counter, "Look at his hands. They're probably too rough to even handle the delicate pieces." James nodded in agreement, though something in his expression suggested he was less certain about their assumptions than he wanted to appear. The whisper carried across the hushed store, causing a few subtle smirks among the other staff members. The security cameras tracked Thomas's movement, their small red lights blinking steadily. The loss prevention team in the back office watched their monitors with unusual attention, not because Thomas posed any real threat, but because his presence disrupted their normal routine of watching for shoplifters in expensive suits and designer dresses. As Thomas approached another display case, the afternoon sun caught something in his eyes, a glimmer of knowledge or purpose that seemed at odds with everyone's assumptions. His calloused fingers, though rough from work, moved with surprising gentleness as he gestured toward the glass, leaving no smudges despite the staff's expectations. The stage was now fully set. The players had revealed themselves, the environment had declared its exclusivity, and the contrast between Thomas and his surroundings couldn't have been more pronounced. Yet there was something in his demeanor, a quiet dignity, that seemed to transcend the superficial judgments surrounding him, hinting at depths that none of the store's occupants had bothered to consider. The first direct interaction came when Sarah Chen lost patience with what she perceived as an awkward disruption to her otherwise perfect sales day. Smoothing her designer skirt, she approached Thomas with the kind of smile reserved for unwanted guests. Professional enough to maintain appearances, but cool enough to discourage prolonged interaction. "Sir," she began, her voice carrying the practiced tone of someone who had mastered the art of polite dismissal, "are you looking for something specific?" The emphasis on the last word drew quiet snickers from her colleagues. Behind her, James Morton pretended to organize already perfectly arranged displays, keeping one ear tuned to the interaction. Thomas turned to face her, his movement unhurried and deliberate. The sun through the windows highlighted the threads of silver in his hair, and for a moment his quiet dignity made Sarah's practiced superiority seem almost childish. "Yes, actually," he replied, his voice carrying the kind of warmth that comes from years of early morning greetings to farmhands and neighboring farmers. "I'd like to see your finest pieces." A ripple of poorly concealed amusement spread through the store. Mrs. Wellington Pierce raised her perfectly groomed eyebrows so high they nearly disappeared beneath her designer haircut. Her companion, a woman dripping in diamonds, pressed her lips together to suppress a laugh. Sarah's professional smile faltered for a moment before she recovered. "Our finest pieces," she repeated, as if the words themselves were foreign coming from someone like him. Her eyes darted to Mr. Harrison, who had moved closer, his expensive shoes making no sound on the marble floor. "Perhaps," Mr. Harrison interjected smoothly, his voice carrying the weight of authority earned through years of catering to Manhattan's elite, "you'd be more comfortable at our sister store downtown. They have a lovely selection of more accessible pieces." The suggestion hung in the air, its true meaning clear to everyone present. Thomas seemed to consider this for a moment, his weathered hands resting casually in his overall pockets. The leather wallet in his back pocket, held together by its simple rubber band, seemed to mock the suggested downgrade. "No," he replied simply. "I believe what I'm looking for is right here." The security guard, Michael Torres, shifted his position slightly, moving closer to the scene. His hand rested casually on his radio, ready for any situation that might require intervention. The other customers had stopped pretending to shop, now openly watching the drama unfold. Sarah exchanged glances with James, who had abandoned all pretense of organizing and now stood watching with undisguised curiosity. "Sir," she tried again, her tone becoming more pronounced, "our pieces here start at prices that might be unexpected." She paused, searching for the most diplomatic way to continue. "Perhaps if you shared your budget, we could better assist you." The question was a common tactic used to weed out window shoppers and dreamers, but Thomas remained unruffled. His eyes, sharp and clear despite his advanced years, scanned the displays with the same careful attention he might give to checking his crops before harvest. "The budget," he said slowly, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent store, "won't be a problem." The statement, delivered without bravado or defensiveness, somehow made the staff's assumptions seem even more presumptuous. A young intern, newly hired, and still learning the store's unwritten rules, failed to suppress a giggle. The sound earned her a sharp look from Mr. Harrison, but it captured the general sentiment in the store. Disbelief tinged with amusement at what they perceived as an obvious misunderstanding of their establishment's caliber. Mr. Harrison stepped forward again, positioning himself between Thomas and the store's most expensive display case. "Sir," he began, his tone now carrying an edge of impatience, "our clientele typically makes appointments for viewing our premium collections. Perhaps we could schedule something for you after hours." The suggestion was clear. Come back when fewer people could witness this uncomfortable intersection of worlds. Thomas's response was to reach into his pocket, pulling out not a business card or phone to make an appointment, but a small, worn photograph. The edges were soft from years of handling, the image showing a young woman in a graduation cap and gown, her smile radiant with achievement and promise. The presence of the photograph seemed to catch everyone off guard. It was such a personal gesture, so out of place in this temple of commerce and luxury, that even Sarah's practiced professional demeanor wavered slightly. "My granddaughter," Thomas explained, though no one had asked. "She's graduating medical school next week, top of her class at Johns Hopkins." There was no boasting in his voice, just simple pride and love that seemed to cut through the artificial atmosphere of the store like a ray of genuine sunlight. The revelation created a momentary crack in the staff's unified front of judgment. For just a second, Thomas was no longer just a farmer who had wandered into the wrong store. He was a grandfather wanting to celebrate his granddaughter's achievement. But the moment passed quickly as Mr. Harrison cleared his throat, clearly preparing to suggest once again that Thomas might be more comfortable elsewhere. Before Mr. Harrison could speak, Thomas turned his attention to a particular display case, one that housed the store's most exquisite collection. Behind the flawless glass lay a stunning diamond necklace, its centerpiece a rare pink diamond surrounded by perfectly matched white diamonds, each one catching and reflecting light in a mesmerizing dance. "I'd like to see that one," Thomas said quietly, pointing to the necklace that even Mrs. Wellington Pierce had only admired from afar. The piece was so exclusive that its price tag was discreetly hidden, a common practice for items that exceeded the $1 million mark. A collective gasp rippled through the store. Sarah's perfectly maintained composure cracked slightly, her eyes widening in disbelief. James Morton, who had been hovering nearby, actually took a step backward, as if Thomas's request had physically pushed him. "Sir," Mr. Harrison intervened, his voice strained with forced patience. "That particular piece is part of our heritage collection. It features a 4.6-carat fancy vivid pink diamond, accompanied by over 15 carats of colorless diamonds, all set in platinum and rose gold. It's quite valuable." The last words were emphasized with careful deliberation. Thomas nodded thoughtfully, as if Mr. Harrison had just described the qualities of a particularly good harvest. "Yes, I can see that. The craftsmanship reminds me of my grandfather's pocket watch, the way each piece fits together just so." His observation, surprisingly astute, caused several staff members to exchange uncertain glances. Mrs. Wellington Pierce had abandoned all pretense of discretion and was now openly staring, her companion frantically typing on her phone, undoubtedly sharing this unprecedented scene with her social circle. The young intern had stopped restocking business cards, her mouth slightly open as she watched the situation unfold. "Perhaps," Sarah interjected, desperately trying to regain control of the situation, "I could show you something more traditional? We have some lovely pieces that might be more suitable for a graduation gift." She gestured toward a case containing more modest items, though even these were well into the five-figure range. Thomas remained focused on the pink diamond necklace, his weathered face reflected in the pristine glass. "No, I believe this is the My Katie. She's always loved pink. Used to spend hours in our cherry orchard when the blossoms came out each spring." His voice carried a warmth that seemed out of place in the cold elegance of the store. Mr. Harrison's professional mask slipped slightly, revealing genuine exasperation. "Sir, this piece is priced at $2.4 million. It's not something we typically remove from the display without proper verification." The price was stated bluntly, clearly intended to end this increasingly uncomfortable situation. Instead of backing away, Thomas smiled slightly. "Yes, that sounds about right. Would you mind taking it out so I can see how it catches the light? These old eyes aren't what they used to be." His request was made with such casual ease that it momentarily stunned everyone into silence. Sarah let out a small, nervous laugh that she quickly tried to disguise as a cough. James Morton had given up all pretense of work and was now openly watching, his sales pad forgotten in his hand. The security guard had moved even closer, his expression a mixture of concern and curiosity. "Mr. Miller," Mr. Harrison began, having glimpsed the name embroidered on Thomas's overalls, "I hope you understand our position. This piece represents a significant investment, and we have certain protocols." He trailed off as Thomas reached into his pocket again, this time pulling out not another photograph, but a business card. The card was simple, printed on quality stock, but without the flashy embellishments favored by many of the store's usual clients. Mr. Harrison accepted it with visible reluctance, his eyes scanning the text. Whatever he read caused his perfectly maintained composure to waver noticeably. "I see," he said after a long moment, his tone shifting subtly. "However, we still maintain strict protocols regarding our heritage collection. Perhaps, if you'd like, to make an appointment with our private showing room." His voice carried a new note of uncertainty, as if he was no longer quite sure how to handle the situation. Thomas's response was to reach for his worn leather wallet, the one held together with a rubber band that had drawn so many disapproving glances. "I understand your concerns," he said, his voice carrying the same patient tone he might use when explaining crop rotation to a new farmer. "But I'm afraid my schedule is quite full with the spring planting. I'd prefer to handle this today, if possible." The atmosphere in the store had shifted from amusement to uncertainty. The other customers, who had been so quick to judge earlier, now watched with undisguised curiosity. Even Mrs. Wellington Pierce had stopped pretending to examine her manicure and was openly staring at the scene unfolding before her. Despite the business card that had caused Mr. Harrison's momentary hesitation, Sarah Chen decided to make one final attempt to redirect Thomas's attention. Her designer heels clicked purposefully on the marble floor as she approached a different display case, her reflection showing practiced confidence that seemed slightly forced now. "Mr. Miller," she began, her voice honey-sweet but laden with condescension, "while we appreciate your interest in our heritage collection, perhaps I could show you something more traditional for a graduation gift." She gestured toward a case containing elegant but significantly less expensive pieces. We have some lovely pendants that would be perfect for a young doctor starting her career. A few other employees, emboldened by Sarah's approach, gathered nearby, their whispered comments barely concealed. "Does he even know what a pink diamond is?" one murmured. "Probably thinks it's rose quartz," another added with a suppressed laugh. James Morton, attempting to appear helpful while barely concealing his skepticism, pulled out a tablet displaying their digital catalogue. "Sir, we have an excellent selection of items under $50,000, much more appropriate for a graduation gift. Wouldn't you agree?" His tone suggested he thought even that price range was stretching it. Thomas stood quietly, his weathered hands clasped patiently in front of him. The afternoon sun, streaming through the windows, cast his shadow long across the marble floor, somehow making him seem more substantial despite the attempts to diminish him. "I appreciate your suggestions," he said calmly, "but I've done my research. That pink diamond piece is exactly what I'm looking for." A young saleswoman in the back, clearly new to the store, failed to contain her reaction. "Research?" she whispered too loudly to her colleague. "What, did he Google most expensive necklace in Manhattan between milking cows?" The comment drew several poorly concealed snickers from the staff. Mrs. Wellington Pierce, still perched on her velvet chair, touched her own diamond necklace reflexively. "Darling," she called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone used to being heard, "perhaps you should listen to these good people. They know what they're talking about." Her tone was patronizing, as if she were speaking to a child who didn't understand the value of money. Mr. Harrison stepped forward again, his patience visibly wearing thin. "Mr. Miller, while we appreciate your interest, the Heritage Collection requires extensive verification procedures. We simply can't remove pieces of this caliber without proper documentation of intent and ability to purchase." His words were carefully chosen, each one designed to emphasize the gap between Thomas and the store's usual clientele. Thomas reached into his pocket, removing a folded piece of paper that looked official in nature. "Would a letter from First National Bank help with your verification process?" he asked mildly, holding out the document. The paper, despite being folded, was crisp and professional looking. Sarah intercepted the letter before Mr. Harrison could reach it, her manicured fingers handling it as if it might be contaminated. She unfolded it with exaggerated care, her eyes scanning the contents. Her expression shifted from dismissive to confused, then back to professional skepticism. "This appears to be a bank letter," she admitted reluctantly, passing it to Mr. Harrison. "But surely you understand, Mr. Miller, that a piece like this requires more than just financial verification. Our Heritage Collection pieces are typically sold to collectors, connoisseurs, people who truly understand their value and history." The implication was clear. Thomas, in his farming clothes and work boots, couldn't possibly appreciate the artistic and historical significance of such a piece. The other employees nodded in agreement, their expressions a mixture of superiority and faux sympathy. "Tell me," Thomas said quietly, his eyes fixed on the pink diamond necklace, "about the cut of the center stone. It's cushion cut, isn't it? Reminds me of the one Marie Antoinette wore, though hers was blue, of course." The casual observation, dropped so naturally into the conversation, caused several jaws to drop. Mr. Harrison's perfectly maintained composure cracked slightly. You're familiar with the French crown jewels?" The question came out before he could stop himself, his tone betraying his surprise. "My Katie," Thomas replied, pulling out the graduation photo again. "She didn't just inherit her mother's eyes. She got her grandfather's passion for geology. We spent many evenings studying famous diamonds together. She could name every significant stone by the time she was 12. The revelation caused a moment of uncertain silence among the staff. Sarah's confident smirk wavered slightly. while James Morton suddenly found his tablet extremely interesting, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat, clearly trying to regain control of the situation that was starting to slip away from their usual script. Adjusting his Italian silk tie, he stepped forward with an air of finality, prepared to end what he still believed was an exercise in futility. "Mr. Miller," he began, his voice carrying the weight of someone about to deliver what he considered a devastating blow. "Perhaps we should be completely transparent about the investment required here." He paused for dramatic effect, exchanging knowing glances with his staff. "This particular piece from our heritage collection is priced at $2,475,000. That's $2,175,000. He enunciated each number, clearly and slowly, as if explaining complex mathematics to a child. The price hung in the air like a challenge, echoing off the crystal chandeliers and marble floors. Several employees barely contained their smirks, certain this would finally end their unusual afternoon. "And that's before tax, of course," Sarah added helpfully, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. She pulled out a calculator, making a show of typing numbers. "With New York State sales tax, we're looking at approximately $2,699,687.50 exactly." The other customers in the store had completely abandoned any pretense of shopping, now fully invested in what they assumed would be the farmer's moment of embarrassed realization. Mrs. Wellington Pierce actually leaned forward in her velvet chair, not wanting to miss what she expected would be a spectacular retreat. "That's quite precise," Thomas remarked calmly, showing no sign of the shock or embarrassment they had anticipated. Instead, he seemed to be studying the necklace with even greater interest, his eyes following the play of light across the rare pink diamond. "Though your tax calculation is off by about $12.38 by my count." The observation, delivered so casually, caused Sarah to blink in surprise. She quickly rechecked her calculator, her perfectly manicured nails clicking against the keys. A faint blush crept up her neck as she realized he was correct. "Well," she recovered quickly, "the exact amount can be determined at the time of purchase, which, of course." She left the sentence hanging, the implication clear in her tone. Thomas nodded thoughtfully, as if considering a fair price for a bushel of apples at the farmer's market. "The pink diamond," he said, his voice carrying the same practical tone. "He might use discussing crop yields. It's graded as fancy vivid, isn't it? The color saturation is remarkable." Mr. Harrison's practiced smile faltered slightly. "You seem unexpectedly knowledgeable about diamonds, Mr. Miller." The admission seemed to pain him slightly, as if he were betraying his own prejudices by acknowledging it. "When you spend your life watching things grow," Thomas replied, his eyes still on the necklace, "you develop an appreciation for natural wonders. Whether it's a perfect apple or a perfect diamond, quality has a way of showing itself." James Morton, who had been hovering nearby with his tablet, couldn't resist adding his own attempt at deterrence. "Sir, perhaps we should discuss our financing options. For qualified buyers, we offer various payment plans." His voice trailed off as Thomas turned to look at him directly. "That won't be necessary," Thomas said simply, reaching for his worn leather wallet once again, "though I appreciate the suggestion." The young intern who had been watching the scene unfold whispered to her colleague, loud enough for others to hear, "Does he think he's going to pull out $3 million from that old thing?" The comment drew several poorly concealed laughs. From the staff, Mr. Harrison, perhaps feeling he needed to end this situation before it became even more awkward, stepped forward with an air of finality. "Mr. Miller, while we appreciate your interest, perhaps we should be realistic about this situation. A piece of this caliber requires not just financial capability, but also a certain understanding of its significance, its provenance, its In place in the world of high jewelry, the condescension in his voice was unmistakable, and several staff members nodded in agreement, confident that their manager was finally putting an end to this unusual disruption of their normal routine. Thomas listened to this speech with the same patient expression he had maintained throughout the afternoon. When Mr. Harrison finished, he simply reached into his inside pocket and removed an envelope that, like everything else about him, appeared deceptively simple. The envelope Thomas removed was simple white banking stationery, bearing the embossed logo of First National Bank of Manhattan. With steady hands that had spent decades tending to crops, he carefully opened it and removed several official bank documents. The crisp sound of the papers unfolding seemed to echo in the now silent store, cutting through the classical music playing softly in the background. "I believe," Thomas said quietly, "these might help with your verification process." He handed the documents to Mr. Harrison, whose perfectly manicured fingers accepted them with visible reluctance. The manager's eyes scanned the first page, then quickly darted back to the top to read it again, his composed expression cracking slightly. A bead of sweat formed on his forehead, threatening to disturb his immaculate appearance. Sarah Chen, unable to contain her curiosity, peered over Mr. Harrison's shoulder, her designer heels bringing her to just the right height to read the documents. Her carefully maintained professional mask slipped completely as she read the contents, her perfectly lined lips forming a small O of surprise. The young intern, who had been so quick to joke earlier, craned her neck, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever had caused such a reaction, nearly knocking over a display of diamond-cleaning cloths in her eagerness. "This is—" Mr. Harrison cleared his throat, suddenly finding his silk tie too tight. His fingers, usually so steady when handling precious gems, trembled slightly as they gripped the papers. "This is a bank statement showing liquid assets of—" He paused, seemingly unable to complete the sentence, as if the numbers before him defied his understanding of the world. $28 million, Thomas finished for him, his voice carrying the same matter-of-fact tone he might use to discuss the morning's weather forecast. Plus some change. The apple orchards had a good year, and the wind farm investments didn't hurt either. His words hung in the air like the last notes of a symphony, resonating through the stunned silence of the store. The revelation hit them store like a physical wave, rippling through the space and changing the very atmosphere. Mrs. Wellington Pierce, who had been holding court from her velvet chair, actually stood up, her designer heels clicking on the marble floor as she stepped closer to better observe this unexpected turn of events. Her companion nearly dropped her phone, fumbling to maintain her grip on the device that had been so busy documenting what they'd assumed would be a humorous scene. "Wind farm?" James Morton repeated weakly, his tablet forgotten in his suddenly limp hands. The sleek device nearly slipped from his grasp, saved only by years of professional reflexes. His face had lost its practiced smile, replaced by an expression of genuine astonishment. Thomas nodded, a slight smile playing at the corners of his weathered face. "Started investing in renewable energy about 15 years ago. Turns out those empty fields were good for more than just crops." He paused, his eyes twinkling with a wisdom that now seemed profound rather than provincial. "Though the organic apple orchards still do quite well, you'd be surprised how much people in the city will pay for authentic farm-to-table produce, especially those fancy restaurants just a few blocks from here." The security guard, who had been hovering nearby throughout the entire interaction, suddenly straightened his posture, his hand dropping away from his radio as if it had burned him. The young saleswoman who had made the tractor comment earlier was now studying her designer shoes intently, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment that matched the red soles of her expensive footwear. The other customers in the store had abandoned all pretense of disinterest. A gentleman in a bespoke suit who had been examining watches nearby actually removed his glasses and cleaned them as if doubting what he was witnessing. A young couple who'd been looking at engagement rings stood frozen, their own financial discussions forgotten in the wake of the unfolding scene. "But Sarah began, then caught herself realizing how her next words might sound. The unfinished sentence hung in the air. "But you're just a farmer." Her voice trailed off, the word "just" now seeming incredibly inappropriate. "I'm a farmer who believes in diversification," Thomas replied mildly, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the chaos his revelation had caused. "Just like I don't plant only one crop, I don't keep my investments in only one place." He gestured to the additional papers still in Mr. Harrison's hands. "The next page shows the wire transfer authorization for $3 million. I figured that would cover the necklace and any additional pieces that might catch my eye." Mr. Harrison's hands were actually trembling slightly as he turned to the next page, confirming Thomas's words. The official bank seal and authorization codes were clearly visible, along with a number that made several zeros dance before his eyes. The paper, despite its simple appearance, might as well have been solid gold for the effect it was having on the store's atmosphere. "The thing about farming," Thomas continued, his voice carrying through the stunned silence of the store, "is that it teaches you patience. You learn to look beyond surface appearances. A seed doesn't look like much, but plant it in good soil, tend it carefully, and you might be surprised at what grows." His words carried the weight of decades of wisdom, each syllable falling like seeds on fertile ground. The transformation in the store's atmosphere was immediate and dramatic. Mr. Harrison's entire demeanor shifted like a weather vane in changing winds, his previous condescension melting away faster than morning frost under a summer sun. The very air seemed to change, the quiet background music suddenly seeming inappropriately subdued for such a prestigious client. "Mr. Miller," he began, his voice now dripping with a warmth that had been conspicuously absent moments before. "I believe we may have started off on the wrong foot. Please allow me to escort you to our private viewing room." He gestured toward a discreet door behind the main counter, reserved for the store's most distinguished clients. Sarah Chen, who had been frozen in place since the revelation, suddenly sprang into action. "I'll fetch our finest champagne," she announced, her designer heels clicking rapidly across the marble floor as she hurried toward the store's temperature-controlled wine cabinet. "The Dom Perignon Rosé, of course," she added, as if anything less would be unthinkable now. James Morton had recovered enough to start frantically updating the store's client database on his tablet. His fingers flew across the screen, creating a new VIP profile. "Mr. Miller, sir, if I could just confirm a few details for our records. We'll want to ensure you receive all our exclusive invitations and previews of new collections." The young intern who had earlier joked about tractors now stood mortified, her face a shade of red that matched the signature soles of her borrowed designer shoes. She busied herself straightening already perfectly arranged displays, trying to make herself as invisible as possible. Mrs. Wellington Pierce, who had previously viewed Thomas with barely concealed disdain, now maneuvered closer, her jewelry jingling softly as she moved. "I simply must introduce myself," she declared, extending a hand laden with rings. "Any investor in renewable energy is a friend of mine. I've been telling everyone at the club that green energy is the future. Thomas accepted her handshake with the same calm dignity he had maintained throughout the afternoon, seemingly unchanged by the dramatic shift in his treatment. "The wind farms have been quite successful," he acknowledged politely, "though I find watching the turbines spin almost as satisfying as watching wheat sway in the breeze." The security guard had completely abandoned his post near the entrance, now holding the private viewing room door open with an exaggerated flourish. The room beyond gleamed with soft, expertly directed lighting, its plush furnishings, a testament to the store's commitment to luxury. Mr. Miller, Mr. Harrison continued, practically bouncing on his Italian leather shoes. Please, allow me to personally show you our complete heritage collection. The pink diamond necklace you admired is just the beginning. We have several pieces that I believe would perfectly complement it. Sarah returned, with not just champagne, but a full silver tray of appetizers that seemed to have materialized from nowhere. These are from Le Bernardin, she explained, pronouncing the restaurant's name with perfect French accent. We keep a small selection for our most distinguished clients. The other customers in the store had transformed from amused spectators to interested observers, each one trying to position themselves close enough to overhear any additional details about this surprising multimillionaire farmer. The young couple, looking at engagement rings, whispered to each other, their own shopping temporarily forgotten. Thomas observed this whirlwind of activity with the same patient expression he had worn throughout the afternoon. "That's very kind," he said, his voice maintaining its humble tone despite the chaos around him. "But I think I'd prefer to continue our discussion right here. Sometimes the simplest settings let us focus on what's really important." Mr. Harrison's face flickered with momentary confusion. No VIP had ever declined the private viewing room before. Of course, he recovered quickly. "Whatever makes you most comfortable, sir. Sarah, perhaps you could bring the champagne. Here. And James, do fetch the complete documentation for the pink diamond necklace. Mr. Miller will want to see the certification papers." Thomas glanced at his well-worn watch, the same timepiece that had drawn disapproving looks earlier. "Actually," he said, "I think we should focus on completing the purchase. My granddaughter's graduation ceremony is next week, and I still have the evening milking to tend to." The mention of milking cows, which would have drawn snickers just minutes before, now elicited nods of appreciation. "How admirable," Mrs. Wellington Pierce declared, "maintaining one's responsibilities regardless of wealth. That's the sign of true success." James Morton, who had returned with a leather portfolio containing the necklace's documentation, nodded enthusiastically. "Absolutely admirable," he agreed, though he had never given a moment's thought to milking cows before this moment. As the transaction began to take shape, the store's atmosphere continued its remarkable transformation. Mr. Harrison personally retrieved the pink diamond necklace from its display, handling it with even more reverence than usual. The security cameras whirred softly as they followed his movement, their operators in the back office now fully invested in this unprecedented scene. "The craftsmanship is truly exceptional," Mr. Harrison explained, his voice taking on a scholarly tone as he placed the necklace on a black velvet display pad. Each diamond was hand-selected to ensure perfect color matching, and the setting was crafted by our most skilled artisans. He spoke as if these details hadn't been met with dismissive silence when Thomas had inquired earlier. Sarah Chen hovered nearby, champagne tray still in hand, her earlier condescension replaced by an almost desperate eagerness to be helpful. "The pink diamond's color saturation is particularly remarkable," she added, trying to demonstrate her expertise. "It's quite rare to find one of this size with such perfect hue consistency." Thomas examined the necklace carefully, his weathered and steady as he lifted it for closer inspection. The other customers watched in fascination as this man, whom they had all dismissed as out of place, demonstrated a surprising knowledge of fine jewelry. "The pavilion angles are precisely cut," he observed, holding the piece up to the light. "Whoever did the cutting understood how to maximize the color without sacrificing brilliance." His comment caused Mr. Harrison's eyebrows to rise slightly. It was the kind of technical observation usually made by seasoned collectors. James Morton, still clutching his tablet, quickly pulled up additional information. "The master cutter spent over 6 months working on the center stone alone," he offered. though this detail hadn't seemed worth mentioning during their earlier interactions. We have the complete cutting process documented if you'd like to see it. The young intern, who had been trying to blend into the background, couldn't help but watch in amazement as Thomas handled the multi-million-dollar piece with the same careful confidence he might show while examining a perfectly ripe apple. His calloused fingers, which had drawn so many disapproving glances earlier, now seemed to possess a wisdom that transcended their rough appearance. The clasp mechanism is particularly secure, Thomas noted, testing it gently. Important for active wear. Katie's always moving around the hospital, you know. Can't have it coming loose during her rounds. The practical consideration, delivered in his matter-of-fact tone, somehow made the extravagant purchase seem almost sensible. Mrs. Wellington Pierce, who had appointed herself as an unofficial witness to the transaction, nodded approvingly. "How thoughtful," she declared to no one in particular. "A true investment piece. I always say fine jewelry should be worn, not just stored away in a vault." The processing of the payment itself became an event of almost ceremonial significance. Mr. Harrison insisted on handling it personally, something he usually delegated to senior sales staff. The credit card machine, which had processed countless luxury purchases before, seemed to hum with extra importance as it printed out the receipt. "For this remarkable sale, would you like us to arrange for secure transport?" Mr. Harrison inquired, his tone suggesting that someone of Thomas's standing couldn't possibly be expected to carry such a valuable piece themselves. "We have relationships with several discreet security services." Thomas shook his head, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "No need for that," he said, patting the pocket of his overalls. "Been carrying valuable things across this city for longer than you might think. Amazing how little attention people pay to an old farmer on the subway." The statement caused several of the store's employees to shift uncomfortably, all too aware of how they had exemplified that very behavior just hours earlier. Sarah Chen's cheeks flushed again as she remembered her tractor comment, the words now seeming to echo accusingly in her memory. "At least allow us to provide our signature packaging," Mr. Harrison insisted, signaling for their finest presentation box to be brought forward. The box itself was a work of art, crafted from rare wood and lined with hand-stitched silk. "We can have it custom engraved with your granddaughter's initials before you leave." Thomas considered this for a moment, running his hand along the box's polished surface. "That's very kind," he said finally, "but I think I'll keep it simple. Katie was always more interested in substance than show." The subtle lesson in his words wasn't lost on anyone present. As the final details of the sale were being processed, the store's other customers had given up any pretense of shopping, completely absorbed in watching this unexpected drama reach its conclusion. The young couple who had been looking at engagement rings whispered to each other, their own purchase decisions now seeming to take on new perspective. The moment had arrived for Thomas to depart, but his exit would prove just as memorable as his entrance. Standing near the store's grand entrance, he carefully tucked the elegantly wrapped package containing the pink diamond necklace into a simple canvas tote bag he pulled from his overall pocket, the kind used for carrying fresh produce at farmers' markets. The contrast between the multi-million-dollar purchase and its humble transportation drew poorly concealed gasps from the onlooking staff. Mr. Harrison, still hovering anxiously nearby, couldn't quite hide his concern. "Mr. Miller, are you absolutely certain you wouldn't prefer our secure delivery service? We could have it sent directly to your granddaughter's graduation ceremony." His perfectly manicured hands fidgeted with his tie clip, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of such a valuable piece leaving in such an ordinary container. Thomas secured the tote bag with the same careful attention he might give to handling delicate seedlings. "Thank you, but I've always believed in delivering special gifts personally." He patted the bag gently. Besides, I need to stop by the farm stand on my way home. The early summer strawberries are coming in nicely. Sarah Chen, who had maintained a constant presence throughout the final transaction, stepped forward. Her designer heels no longer clicked with quite the same confidence they had shown earlier. "Mr. Miller," she began, her voice carrying a note of genuine humility that had been absent before, "I hope you'll accept my personal apology for my earlier assumptions." Thomas turned to face her, his weathered face showing no trace of resentment. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "every spring I plant new apple trees in my orchard. Some of the strongest ones grow from the most modest-looking saplings. Nature has a way of teaching us not to judge too quickly." The metaphor hung in the air, its meaning clear to everyone present. The young intern who had made the tractor joke earlier stepped forward hesitantly. "Sir," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I feel terrible about what I said before. I was wrong, and I'm so sorry." Her face was flushed with genuine remorse. Her earlier smugness completely evaporated. Thomas's response was to reach into his tote bag and pull out something unexpected, a small red apple. He handed it to the surprised intern with a gentle smile. "From my orchard," he explained. "Sometimes the sweetest fruit comes after the hardest lessons." The simple gesture, somehow both a forgiveness and a teaching moment, brought tears to the young woman's eyes. The security guard, who had spent the afternoon transitioning from suspicious observation to embarrassed respect, held the door open with an almost ceremonial flourish. As Thomas approached the exit, every employee in the store seemed to hold their breath, aware that they were witnessing something more significant than just the departure of a wealthy client. Mrs. Wellington Pierce, still determined to maintain her self-appointed role as social ambassador, made one final attempt at connection. "Mr. Miller, you simply must join us at the Metropolitan Club. They're always looking for innovative investors interested in sustainable agriculture." She pressed her business card into his hand with the practice of someone used to expanding her social circle. Thomas accepted the card with polite grace, but tucked it into his pocket without comment. Instead, he paused at the threshold of the store, turning to address the assembled crowd one last time. The late afternoon sun streaming through the windows caught the silver in his hair, creating an almost ethereal effect. "You know," he said, his voice carrying easily in the hushed store, "my grandfather used to say that true value isn't in what you own, but in how you treat others. He built our farm from nothing, working the same land I work today. He taught me that wealth isn't about what's in your wallet. It's about what's in your heart." The profound silence that followed his words was broken only by the soft sound of someone, possibly the young intern, sniffling back tears. Mr. Harrison, whose entire career had been built on measuring value in carats and dollars, found himself unable to form a response. Thomas adjusted his worn cap, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I should be getting back to the farm. The evening milking won't wait, even for pink diamonds." With that simple, "You're absolutely right, I apologize for not meeting the 1,000-word requirement. Let me rewrite Part 12, Viewer Engagement Close, Final Message, with significantly more detail. Part 12, Viewer Engagement Close, Final Message." As the day drew to a close at Cartwright Sons, the story of Thomas Miller, the farmer who taught Manhattan's elite a priceless lesson, was already spreading beyond the store's walls. The employees, closing up for the evening, found themselves sharing knowing looks as they recalled the events that had transformed their perspectives. The setting sun cast long shadows through the store's windows, its golden light reminiscent of the warmth Thomas had brought to their usually formal establishment. Mr. Harrison stood at his desk, making a final note in the day's ledger. Beyond the substantial sale, he wrote something personal. Today, our store sold one of our finest pieces, but the real value wasn't in the transaction, it was in the transformation of our hearts and minds. His hand, usually so steady when writing sales figures, trembled slightly as he documented this unprecedented day. Sarah Chen, organizing her station for the evening, carefully placed the calculator she had used to compute the tax, incorrectly, in her drawer. The memory of Thomas's quiet correction of her mathematics brought a flush to her cheeks, but also a smile. She had learned more about genuine class in one afternoon than in all her years of luxury retail. The evening cleaning crew arrived, ready to restore the marble floors to their usual gleam. As they worked to remove the subtle traces of earth left by Thomas's boots, one of the employees stopped them. "Leave it for tonight," she said softly. "Sometimes we need reminders of our most important lessons." The marks on the floor, which had earlier drawn such disdain, now seemed like precious artifacts of a transformative moment. The young intern, still holding the apple Thomas had given her, finally placed it carefully in her bag, treating it with the same reverence usually reserved for the store's finest jewelry. She had already decided to save its seeds, a small gesture of hope that she too could grow something meaningful from this experience. This story serves as a powerful reminder that true worth cannot be measured in dollars and cents, and that dignity and grace often come in unexpected packages. Like the wind farms Thomas had invested in, change can come from unexpected sources, transforming barren fields into sources of power and possibility. The impact of Thomas's visit extended far beyond the substantial sale recorded in the store's ledger. Each person who witnessed his quiet dignity and profound wisdom had been changed in ways that no amount of luxury goods could achieve. His presence had shattered their preconceptions like sunlight breaking through clouds, illuminating truths they had forgotten or perhaps never known. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to reflect on its deeper meanings. Consider how often we might have missed wisdom because it came in unexpected packaging. Think about the Thomas Millers in your own life, those whom you might have judged too quickly or dismissed too easily. We invite you to be part of this continuing conversation. Share your own stories of misjudgment and learning. Have you ever been judged unfairly based on your appearance? How did you handle it? What moments in your life have taught you to look beyond surface impressions? When have you caught yourself making assumptions that proved to be completely wrong? How has an unexpected encounter changed your perspective on wealth, success, or dignity? Your experiences matter. Each story shared helps build a more understanding and compassionate world. Like Thomas's careful tending of his orchards, every small action toward greater understanding helps grow a better future. Remember, Thomas's profound wisdom. True value isn't in what you own, but in how you treat others. In a world increasingly focused on external appearances and material success, these words remind us of what truly matters. Like his organic apples and wind farms, the most valuable things often grow from humble beginnings. Consider how you might apply this lesson in your own life. How can you show more kindness to strangers? What assumptions might you need to challenge? Where might you find wisdom in unexpected places? Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that remind us of life's most valuable lessons. Sometimes the most powerful transformations happen in the most unexpected places, even in a luxury jewelry store on a busy Manhattan afternoon. Share this story with someone who needs to hear its message today. Like Thomas, sharing his carefully grown apples, sometimes the simplest gestures can carry the most profound meanings. Together, we can cultivate a world where people are valued for who they are, not what they wear or what they own. Remember, every person you meet carries their own story, their own struggles and their own wisdom. Be kind, always, because like Thomas Miller proved, You never know when someone might be carrying multi-million-dollar lessons beneath their humble exterior. Statement. He turned and walked out of the store, the same unassuming figure who had entered. Hours before, yet somehow leaving the space fundamentally changed. The glass doors swung shut behind Thomas, but the impact of his presence lingered in the store like the afterglow of a sunset. For several long moments, no one moved or spoke, each person lost in their own thoughts and realizations. The classical music that had been playing softly in the background seemed suddenly artificial and out of place. Mr. Harrison was the first to break the silence, running a hand through his perfectly coiffed hair in a gesture that seemed to symbolize the disruption of everything he had thought he knew. In 30 years of luxury retail, he said quietly, almost to himself, I've never been so thoroughly schooled in the art of dignity. Sarah Chen had moved to the window, watching Thomas's figure disappear into the busy Manhattan street. Her reflection in the pristine glass showed an expression of deep contemplation. "Did you see how he handled that necklace?" she asked, turning to her colleagues. Not like someone showing off a purchase, but like someone who truly appreciated its craftsmanship. The young intern sat at her desk, turning the gifted apple in her hands, its red skin as perfect as any gemstone. "He didn't just buy a necklace," she observed, her voice carrying the weight of newfound wisdom. "He taught us all something priceless." A few tears rolled down her cheeks, but she made no move to wipe them away. James Morton had been reviewing the sales record on his tablet, but his focus seemed elsewhere. "You know what strikes me the most?" he said, looking up at his colleagues. "Throughout everything, our judgment, our mockery, our sudden change when we learned who he was, he never once lost his composure. He remained exactly who he was." The security guard, still standing by the door, nodded in agreement. "I've watched thousands of people walk through these doors," he reflected. "The ones trying to prove they belong usually make the biggest show. Mr. Miller wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone." Mrs. Wellington Pierce, who had lingered to witness the aftermath, tapped her designer heel thoughtfully on the marble floor. "Money can buy many things," she mused, more to herself than to others, "but it can't buy that kind of authentic grace." The other customers who had witnessed the entire scene were also processing what they had observed. The young couple, looking at engagement rings, approached the counter with a noticeably different attitude. "We've been so caught up in finding the most expensive ring," the young man admitted, "but Mr. Miller just showed us it's not about the price tag, is it?" Behind the main counter, a senior saleswoman who had been with the store for decades gathered her younger colleagues. "Let this be a lesson," she said, her voice carrying years of experience. "Every person who walks through those doors deserves the same respect we showed Mr. Miller, not after we learned about his wealth, but the respect he deserved from the very beginning." Mr. Harrison called an impromptu staff meeting gathering everyone in a quiet corner of the store. "Today," he began, his usual authoritative tone tempered with humility, "we were reminded of something we should have never forgotten. Our true measure of success isn't in our sales figures or our client list, but in how we treat every single person who walks through those doors." The staff nodded in agreement, many of them unable to meet their manager's eyes as they recalled their earlier behavior. The young intern spoke up, her voice small but determined. "He could have made us feel terrible about how we treated him. He had every right to. But instead, he chose to teach us." Sarah Chen added thoughtfully, "And he didn't just teach us about not judging by appearances. He showed us what real class looks like. It's not about designer labels or expensive accessories. It's about how you carry yourself and treat others." A quiet murmur of agreement rippled through the group. One of the newer employees raised her hand hesitantly. "Does anyone else feel like we got more than we gave today? I mean, we sold an expensive necklace, but we received something much more valuable." The rest of the afternoon passed in an unusual atmosphere of reflection. Every new customer who entered the store was greeted with a genuinely warm welcome, regardless of their appearance. The staff moved with a new awareness, their interactions marked by authentic respect rather than practiced polish. As the day drew to a close at Cartwright Sons, the story of Thomas Miller, the farmer who taught Manhattan's elite a priceless lesson, was already spreading beyond the store's walls. The employees, closing up for the evening, found themselves sharing knowing looks as they recalled the events that had transformed their perspectives. The setting sun cast long shadows through the store's windows, its golden light reminiscent of the warmth Thomas had brought to their usually formal establishment. Mr. Harrison stood at his desk, making a final note in the day's ledger. Beyond the substantial sale, he wrote something personal. "Today, our store sold one of our finest pieces, but the real value wasn't in the transaction. It was in the transformation of our hearts and minds." His hand, usually so steady when writing sales figures, trembled slightly as he documented this unprecedented day. Sarah Chen, organizing her station for the evening, carefully placed the calculator she had used to compute the tax, incorrectly, in her drawer. The memory of Thomas's quiet correction of her mathematics brought a flush to her cheeks, but also a smile. She had learned more about genuine class in one afternoon than in all her years of luxury retail. The evening cleaning crew arrived, ready to restore the marble floors to their usual gleam. As they worked to remove the subtle traces of earth left by Thomas's boots, one of the employees stopped them. "Leave it for tonight," she said softly. "Sometimes we need reminders of our most important lessons." The marks on the floor, which had earlier drawn such disdain, now seemed like precious artifacts of a transformative moment. The young intern, still holding the apple Thomas had given her, finally placed it carefully in her bag, treating it with the same reverence usually reserved for the store's finest jewelry. She had already decided to save its seeds, a small gesture of hope that she too could grow something meaningful from this experience. This story serves as a powerful reminder that true worth cannot be measured in dollars and cents, and that dignity and grace often come in unexpected packages. Like the wind farms Thomas had invested in, change can come from unexpected sources, transforming barren fields into sources of power and possibility. The impact of Thomas's visit extended far beyond the substantial sale recorded in the store's ledger. Each person who witnessed his quiet dignity and profound wisdom had been changed in ways that no amount of luxury goods could achieve. His presence had shattered their preconceptions, like sunlight breaking through clouds, illuminating truths they had forgotten or perhaps never known. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to reflect on its deeper meanings. Consider how often we might have missed wisdom because it came in unexpected packaging. Think about the Thomas Millers in your own life, those whom you might have judged too quickly or dismissed too easily. We invite you to be part of this continuing conversation. Share your own stories of misjudgment and learning. Have you ever been judged unfairly based on your appearance? How did you handle it? Nori, what moments in your life have taught you to look beyond surface impressions? When have you caught yourself making assumptions that proved to be completely wrong? How has an unexpected encounter changed your perspective on wealth, success, or dignity? Your experiences matter. Each story shared helps build a more understanding and compassionate world. Like Thomas's careful tending of his orchards, every small action toward greater understanding helps grow a better future. Remember Thomas's profound wisdom. True value isn't in what you own, but in how you treat others. In a world increasingly focused on external appearances and material success, these words remind us of what truly matters. Like his organic apples and wind farms, the most valuable things often grow from humble beginnings. Consider how you might Apply this lesson in your own life. How can you show more kindness to strangers? What assumptions might you need to challenge? Where might you find wisdom in unexpected places? Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that remind us of life's most valuable lessons. Sometimes the most powerful transformations happen in the most unexpected places, even in a luxury jewelry store on a busy Manhattan afternoon. Share this story with someone who needs to hear its message today. Like Thomas sharing his carefully grown apples, sometimes the simplest gestures can carry the most profound meanings. Together, we can cultivate a world where people are valued for who they are, not what they wear or what they own. Remember, every person you meet carries their own story, their own struggles, and their own wisdom. Be kind, always, because like Thomas Miller proved, you never know when someone might be carrying multi-million-dollar lessons beneath their humble exterior.